On this exciting mini episode, I tell you what I got out of HBO's Perry Mason reboot. The answer? More than I thought I would. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy. I've spent every episode of this podcast reviewing the original TV series or even a couple of made-for-TV movies. But in this mini episode, I take a break to talk about the recently completed Perry Mason reboot that HBO aired this summer. So this bad boy's been in the works for a while. In 2012, Robert Downey Jr., Iron Man himself, signed a deal with Warner Brothers to make a movie with RDJ as Mason. But by 2018, the feature film had become a prestige TV series with HBO, executive produced by Robert Downey Jr. and his wife. But Robert Downey Jr.'s feature film commitments were too much for him to take on the role of America's favorite defense attorney. And so scripts were in development. They're still looking for a lead actor as of 2018. Eventually they settled on Matthew Rhys as Perry Mason. Rhys had starred in the FX series The Americans. As for writing, the show grabbed Ron Fitzgerald and Roland Jones, a writing team that HBO had in-house. There were rumors that the True Detective creator Nick Pizzolatto was going to helm the series, but he was too busy writing True Detective Season 3. And then they grabbed Timothy Van Patten, a seasoned HBO director who had helmed the camera for episodes of The Wire and Boardwalk Empire, to direct every episode of the series. So, the series dropped, and in the first 10 minutes, you know this is not your father's or your mother's Perry Mason. Yes, it's the 30s, it's Hollywood. Perry's a private detective. He's not a lawyer. He's a drunk. He's divorced. He's got a son who he periodically misses a whole lot. He's a war vet who was dishonorably discharged. We get all this in the first couple of episodes. As for the case itself, well, the murder victim is a baby. And we're even given the guilty party pretty early on, basically at the end of the first episode. But by the time it's done, the case connects to the city's religious, political, and organized crime leaders. It's pretty sprawling. And when you finally reach the courtroom in the last 4 episodes of the 8-episode series, we get lots of things that we never see in the TV show. We get opening and closing arguments. We get jury deliberations. We get Perry flubbing various aspects of trial work. Perry becomes a lawyer out of necessity. We meet Della, who is the secretary of the lawyer who employed Perry as a detective. Paul Drake, if you've read anything about the series, you know that he's an African-American policeman who eventually runs afoul of not just his colleagues, because they're racist, but they're also really corrupt. He's a good guy. Hamilton Berger, well, he makes a brief appearance, and you get a sense that he's going to be Perry's antagonist later on, although ironically, he helps Perry out in this series for personal motives. He's an ADA. He wants to replace the current district attorney. And you even get a glimpse of Eva Griffin in the show's final episode. Perry fans will recognize that name. She's the defendant in the case of the Velvet Claws, which was the first Perry Mason novel published in 1933. Let's get to the 3 things I thought made the series worth thinking about. Number 1, the HBO show is all about systems, while the 50s and 60s series was all about individuals. that stark contrast may seem very 2020 to you, and it is. Let's say the 50s and 60s show is the Warren Commission view of Lee Harvey Oswald, and the 2020 Perry Mason is all the books that connect Lee Harvey Oswald to everything from the mafia to the CIA. Every single character in the show is part of a larger network. The kidnapping and murder at the heart of the series, well, it's a combination of crooks, cops, religious leaders, and organized crime members. You never get 2, much less 10 people who conspire together on a murder in the original Mason. It's always one person taking out another person. In the books, Mason does talk a little more readily about the cops as though they're one big group. But there's no hint that the system is inherently corrupt. Trag isn't on the make. Perry respects him. Here, every cop we encounter, save for Paul Drake, is getting money under the table, is somehow connected to the worst parts of the city. The DA's office, no better. The church that we see, it has its true believers, but it also has financial backers who are in bed with the city's worst elements. Conspiracy abounds. Now, this is not something that would have been foreign to Earl Stanley Gardner. Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, Earl Stanley Gardner's contemporaries, and in many ways his influences, really acknowledged a conspiratorial view of crime. That was not what Gardner chose to examine. It's not what the 50s and 60s TV show examined. It's not new, and it's not necessarily wrong, but it is something that's different in this show than the other Perry Mason novels and shows I've looked at. And it was worth considering. I thought getting to see a larger network of crime, of evil doing, was something interesting for Perry to combat. Number 2, the show really made me feel the emotional reality of 2 things. 1, the tragedy of the victim's death, and 2, the just persecution of Perry's client. The 50s and 60s show has so much plot to get through in 50 minutes that the actual death of the victim gets glossed over, or we're made to feel as though it's not that tragic because whoever the murder victim was a royal schnook. As for the defendant, we know in our heads that this person has been accused of a heinous crime, and we occasionally get a scene inside of a prison where the defendant will seem forlorn. They've been separated from the ones they love. But we don't get any scenes where the public utterly loathes them, or the idea that the jury and the people in the public have already convicted the defendant in their minds. In the HBO show, they make the murder victim a baby. They have Perry's client be the assumed guilty party, not to mention the baby's mother. And this sheds some light on what are some really dense emotional issues that the 50s and 60s show just doesn't explore. Perry talks in his closing argument in the HBO show about how the crime made him feel. There are huge swaths of plot devoted to the way the public responds to Perry's client, the mother of the dead child. It's not necessarily wrong for the 50s and 60s show to ignore these things. I'm just saying that you can't help but feel differently about the murder victim, about the defendant, and realize that if in the 50s and 60s show you're a defendant who's been accused of a crime of murdering someone, even if everybody knew this person was a schnook, people would hate you. In the courtroom, there would be animosity just pointed at you all the time. And I thought the HBO series did a really good job of letting the audience not only recognize that, but feel it as well. And number 3, I thought the HBO show did a really good way of illustrating how the criminal justice system affects and is affected by elements of the larger culture. If you watch the 50s and 60s Perry Mason show, you get the sense that the most prominent place in the entire city of Los Angeles is a courtroom, which is not entirely accurate. It might make a really good soundstage in Hollywood, but it's certainly not the most prominent place in the city. So you're not going to encounter much religion at all. Politics, well, if that was a thing, Hamilton Burger would have been written out on a rail after season 1. So you don't really get the mayor of Los Angeles or the sense that the district attorney is getting elected to his position at all. Hollywood, well, in season 1 we get a few episodes, but much less than logic would dictate given the money and star power of Hollywood. The cops, the court, the defense attorneys in the show, they interact with the church, with the mayor, with the movies. The courtroom is just another stage for a potential revival, for a political campaign, for a potential Hollywood blockbuster. The world of Gardner's Mason is pretty hermetically sealed. Mason gets out in the city, he does things, but the name Los Angeles, if you just remove that name and gave a book to someone and said, tell me what city this book is set in, which city this show is set in, I'm not sure that you'd guess Los Angeles. So this is another unexplored lode that I think the HBO series mines to great effect. In conclusion, I left the series having thought about dimensions of the Mason world I had not considered. I'm glad I had the opportunity to watch the show. I thought Della was the best character. Apparently, Matthew Rhys was much more emotionally varied in his performance than what he was able to do in The Americans. I think he got better as the series goes along. They renewed it, so maybe we'll get The Case of the Velvet Claws for season 2. I'm not sure. What did you think? Did you watch it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Were you left cold? I'd love to know. Send me an email at theperrypod@gmail.com. Join me in a couple weeks as I restart our journey through season 2 of Perry Mason with The Case of the Glittering Goldfish. Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.